how psychedelics work, and in addressing that, I want to be as much addressing the phenomenology as the underlying biology. But it all starts somewhere. The psychedelic experience might well feel like magic. It might feel otherworldly. And yet there is a biology. At the end of the day, there is a drug that you've taken. It has a particular molecular structure, and it's going to bind into our inherent biology. So it all starts somewhere. In that sense, it's not magic. It's not working via magic. The experience may well feel magical, but there is a concrete, in a sense, biology here. So where does it all begin? So psychedelic drugs such as LSD, psilocybin, DMT, they all belong to a category of drug called the classic psychedelics, and they all share a certain pharmacology. What that means is that they all bind to a particular protein, a receptor, heavily expressed in the brain, heavily expressed in the human brain, and especially so in regions of the brain, the cortex, that is expanded disproportionately in our species, the so-called high-level association cortex. You can see this image on the left of the screen, which is a positron emission tomography PET scan. It's labeling where those receptors are that psychedelics bind to and stimulate, and the key characteristics, subjective effects, follow from an action in these regions. And the hot colors are showing that's where there's an especially dense expression of these receptors. So what are the receptors? Well, the clue's in the title of the slide, that the serotonin 2A receptors. So key receptors for the action of psychedelics, but more generally, they're receptors that will initiate mechanisms of plasticity, neuroplasticity in the brain, psychological plasticity in terms of the ability to change one's mind, and the location of those receptors highly expressed in the high-level association cortex. It might also be worth knowing that early on in life, actually in utero, stimulating these receptors is involved in the growth of neurons themselves in the cortex, the proliferation of these basal progenitor cells, like neural stem cells, that are responsible for cortical growth. So that's where it all begins with the classic psychedelics. We know that it begins there because if you block this receptor with a blocker, a drug, we call them antagonists, you'll block the trip. You might give the blocker before giving a psychedelic, and then an individual wouldn't have a psychedelic experience. Or even mid-experience, you could introduce the blocker and, in a sense, terminate the experience, cut it short. They're kind of antidotes, these antagonists, these blockers of the 2A receptor. We also know another sanity check here on the right is showing the relationship between the percentage occupancy of these particular receptors and the intensity of the subjective experience. Another bit of evidence, this came in the mid-80s, and this was pretty seminal, was the discovery of a strong correlation between the affinity, or if you want, the stickiness, the binding potential of a range of different psychedelic drugs for this receptor specifically, and the potency of those drugs. So, for example, LSD is a very high affinity for the serotonin 2A receptor, and that in large part explains its remarkable potency, psychoactive in microgram doses, a barely visible sort of speck of salt in a sense, and yet highly psychoactive. So that's where it begins, at the 2A receptor. But what of the other side of the coin? What does psychedelic mean? Well, most literally, psyche means soul. We tend to think of it as meaning mind. I like to remind people that it means soul. For me, that is meaningful. For me, that means the whole of the mind. Doesn't necessarily have to mean anything supernatural. can if you want it to, but for me, it speaks to the whole of the mind. And this is a theme that I want to try and convey in this talk. The other component, another ancient Greek term, albeit slightly changed, delic means to make visible or to make manifest, to reveal. So according to the etymology, if it's true, these are drugs that are revealing the whole of the mind. And that is their most characteristic property. Psychedelic, it comes from this man, Humphrey Osmond, working in the 1950s, and he came up with that term. So what of the phenomenology? How can we approach it in more of a systematic way? Well, a natural question, sort of, taking inspiration from Plato's phrase of carving, like a skilled butcher carving nature at its joints. What's psychedelic? And critically, what's not? What might be close, but nevertheless quite different. And so that was the exercise here. We looked at the effects of a classic psychedelic, and we compared them to two associated compounds, but still somewhat different. MDMA, also known as ecstasy, and ketamine. And the hypothesis coming in was that the classic psychedelics are quite distinct, and perhaps this term psychedelic, revealing the whole of the mind, is apt for the classic psychedelics, and it could be appropriate for these other drugs, but perhaps not necessarily. And maybe there are other properties that are the main thing that these other drugs do. And that's what we found. The short story is that with ketamine, people were more inclined to endorse experiences of dissociation as the main thing that drug does. With MDMA, the main subjective experience was one of loving feelings, feelings of compassion and empathy, and opening up, pro-social feelings. And they could do classic psychedelic effects, such as encapsulated by items like I could see deeply into the human mind. I could see especially deeply into my own mind or psyche. They could do that too. They could have psychedelic effects, but that wasn't necessarily their main thing. So I think it's useful to cover this, because the term psychedelic can be used very broadly, and sometimes we might be using it in a way that's too broad, and we lose, in a sense, the accuracy, the precision perhaps of our definitions, and it becomes all a bit too abstract. So while I would say a compound like ketamine, you could lump it in as a psychedelic. It has psychedelic effects, but perhaps psychedelic effects aren't its principal action. I'd be more inclined to call that, for example, a dissociative, also an anesthetic at high enough doses. So we're hearing about the etymology that psychedelic means revealing the whole of the mind, but how would one go about measuring that in controlled studies? So that was part of the thinking behind our creation of this scale, the psychological insight scale, which was to go after psychological insight. And actually, this particular scale goes after a certain aspect of psychological insight. You might call it personal psychological insight. You're going to see some example items here. I've just highlighted one. I've learned important new ways of thinking about myself and my problems. So this is sort of classic psychotherapy territory, better understanding oneself, and potentially psychedelics being tools to facilitate that classic psychotherapeutic process. So when asking the question how psychedelics work and knowing where we are today with psychedelic medicine, it's really building ahead of steam. It could be this year that we see a major milestone event in terms of the approval, federal approval by the drug regulators, the FDA, of the first psychedelic treatment. I would speculate that that'll be psilocybin therapy for treatment-resistant depression. And I wouldn't be surprised if those headlines come this year. So that's where we are with all of this. It's been fringe for a long time, but that's changing. You have a certain President Trump saying things like, if this ibogaine is as good as people are saying, maybe I'd like to try it. So, these are strange times, very strange times. So let's let that sink in. And if this is what's happening, then it's so important. We have a whole class of new medicines about to break through into the mainstream. Doctors will be able to prescribe this for depression. We've got to know how this thing works. I mean, the public looking in might know about psychedelics in the 60s and the stigma and the drug war propaganda. Is this not like LSD, a one-way ticket to insanity? As if people jumping off buildings? What's going on here? How can this be a medicine? It's really a critical question. How is this working? And so that's what I'll try and address here. And addressing this through the psychology, I would say, is probably the first step. I mean, psychiatry at its heart is about how people feel. The way we measure and diagnose is still coming through how people feel and behave. So there's no getting around that. We might want our crisp biomarkers of different things, but there's no escaping the lived experience. It's really front and center in what we do. And I think it will always be, and it needs to be. How people feel and caring about that has to be of utmost importance. So here are some categories of experience that we measure. We measure them quantitatively with different rating scales. We could look at the challenging experience in sort of ordinary day vernacular. That might be thought of as a bad trip. Bad is a little bit absolutist, but we tend to use the term challenging. You could refer to distressing aspects of the experience, and to be very frank, psychedelic experiences can be incredibly distressing. They can be hellish, they can be nightmarish. And so this measure captures some of that. Another aspect of the experience is the emotional catharsis, the emotional release that happens. I sometimes say, somewhat glibly, that when patients are crying mid-session, we kind of know it's working, the treatment. Mystical type experience as well. This phenomenon can go under various names and frameworks, maybe philosophical frameworks. We could look at it through a framework that is sympathetic to, say, supernaturalism, but not necessarily. We could use more secular terminology and thinking in terms of, say, the unitive experience, the dissolution of self to other and subject to object. That doesn't necessarily need to invoke any supernaturalism at all. And yet this is the territory we're in. This is where a lot of the magic is that people feel. But there's going to be a common, whatever our chosen framework and philosophical perspective here, there's going to be a common underlying biology. I would say we're destined to meet there. There's no escaping that. So this model is highlighting a particular path through which we've found if these things happen, the therapeutic trajectory is most likely. And that's actually the central path here. Emotional breakthrough, emotional release, measured through items like I faced emotionally difficult feelings that I usually push aside. That predicting, so the variance in people's scores of that will predict the variance in scores of psychological insight. I've already addressed that rating scale, but here's another example item. I become more conscious of aspects of my past that I used to ignore or not be fully aware of. So that central path, as things presently stand, I would still commit to saying that this is the best predictive path of a therapeutic trajectory with psychedelic therapy. And that's predicting here generic mental health change, well-being we go with. This is in a large sample of people with a broad variety of mental health presentations. So we go with a generic measure of mental health change. This is a controlled trial. This was a double-blind RCT published some years ago, 2021, New England Journal of Medicine. It was a head-to-head of psilocybin therapy versus a conventional antidepressant. It was Lexapro, escitalopram, 6 weeks of daily escitalopram versus 2 doses of psilocybin therapy for major depressive disorder. And what we found here was some other variables predicting the therapeutic trajectory, in this case going with core symptom severity, depressive symptom severity. And here we found that the quality of the therapeutic relationship, sense of rapport and trust, was predictive of that experience of emotional catharsis. If you feel safe, you're more able to let go, let the emotions flow, the tears flow. And this is the kind of opening up, this is the kind of process that seems to be key for that positive therapeutic trajectory. Rapport measured, it was just 2 items, I believe. This is one of them. I have a good relationship with the main person or people who will look after me during the upcoming experience. So they rate this ahead of time. They typically rate it on the morning of the session. There's been some psychological preparation ahead of the session itself, typically around about 3 hours, give or take. And that's how we tee people up for the experience. Emotional breakthrough, another item. I faced emotionally difficult feelings that I usually push aside. Okay, so we've got the etymology, psychedelic. If we were to go again, it's just me playing around with Greek terms, and psyche and gnosis, and I don't know, it's a bit long-winded, they always are. Psychognosticons, I don't know, knowing the soul. I think there's something neat and sort of to the point with that. But what causes, what drives, what's underneath this psychological process is a key question. What's, in a sense, encoding this in our biology, in our physiology? And that's where we're going to go next. And this is where we go to what I call the entropic brain. These days, I tend to think of it more as a principle than a hypothesis. I've recently published on this in a paper called The Entropic Brain Today. It's an update on the evidence for the initial hypothesis, first presented in 2014. So what is this hypothesis? What is it saying? It's essentially saying that if you look at the amount of potential information carried by a measure of brain activity, the more the potential information, the more going on in the signal that's reading out, the bigger will be the subjective experience. That's the hypothesis. I'll caveat it with all models are wrong. Models are models after all, they're not the territory. All models are wrong, however, some are useful. And so the stronger statement would be, I think this model is useful, and I think there's something to that hypothesis. And that's what this recent paper tries to lay out and demonstrate. Here's a signal of brain activity at the top. It's a trace of scalp electrical fields oscillating that are picked up by, in this case, a dry EEG cap. There's no gel, there's no gunk. It's a pretty straightforward system. Different sensors, you can see an image of it there, contacting the scalp, and we see that oscillating activity. You can see that there's more going on in that upper trace. There's higher entropy. That's the measure here of potential information. I use that term potential consciously because in an anthropomorphic sense, in a human everyday sense, information is only meaningful if it's decoded, if we know that it means something. So potential information is a better way to say it, I believe. Entropy is essentially a measure of the predictability, or rather the unpredictability, of any phenomenon. It's dimensionless in that sense. It could apply to anything in the universe. The more unpredictable it is, the higher the entropy. It's a quantitative measure, but what I'm saying here is it also translates to something qualitative, something subjective, something that can be experienced. In fact, experience itself. So there's our entropic signal at the top. How do we get it? Well, we gave people their first ever trip. In fact, in this study, it wasn't, but it was a high dose of psilocybin, 25 milligrams of psilocybin, active ingredient in so-called magic mushrooms, and compare the signal there to the one underneath. That is the baseline brain activity, no drug, and relatively lower entropy, a more predictable signal, the signal going up and down in quite a predictable fashion. In fact, if you were to dial in, you would notice that this particular wave, this oscillation, is in the alpha range. It's a sort of resident, resting signal, especially strong in our species compared to other animals, and especially so as we mature. It's lower in childhood, strongest into adulthood, and yeah, very strong rhythm that you'll find in human brain activity. So this is there ordinarily. Under the psychedelic, it collapses away that rhythm, and we see this entropic activity. Well, let's go through every single study on this slide. In fact, just read the paper, Entropic Brain Today. But the point is that there's really a wealth of evidence to support the principle. So what are the take-home messages? That rectangle at the top is showing us studies that have found an increase in the entropy of spontaneous brain activity. So that's not induced through some task or some stimulus. It's just ongoing brain activity, and how the entropy of the signal goes up during different altered states of consciousness, characterized by some kind of expansion of subjective experience. So a bunch of psychedelic studies, including ketamine, up to a certain dose, I would say in its psychedelic dose range or psychedelic-like. Ketamine will do this. Once it tips over into being an anesthetic, entropy drops. What about recovery from anesthesia? So you're starting to wake up, entropy comes up. Even strobe light, flicker light, people can trip out on that. Well, lo and behold, entropy goes up during that. What about meditation? Well, for some people, that's a kind of sleepy or frustrating experience. Those individuals, we wouldn't see an increase in brain entropy. But in experienced meditators entering states of deep absorption, immersion, in which perhaps after the fact, or maybe even during, they would say, well, talking would pull them out of the meditation, but they would say that the experience is expansive. Might not be content-rich, it might be relatively content-less in a sense, but they wouldn't say they're asleep. In fact, they would say that they're very awake. And so that expansion of conscious experience is consistent there, and brain entropy will go up in those cases. Breath hold. So atypical breathing has been known for a long time to induce interesting altered states of consciousness, arguably characterized again by this expansion of phenomenal consciousness, conscious experience, and that increases brain entropy. What about sleep? Well, we have different stages. Well, dream sleep, or the stage of sleep in which dreaming is most vivid, and emotional REM sleep, entropy up in that stage relative to non-REM sleep, deep sleep. Emergence of consciousness in individuals with disorders of consciousness. When those lucky few do wake up and regain some level of consciousness, then entropy comes up in those cases. So longitudinal study there, tracking that. And some others, minimally conscious state plus. That was a case of someone in a disorder of consciousness, emerged out of coma, but psilocybin was given, and actually magic mushrooms, and there was an increase in brain entropy, a change in behavior, and sadly not an emergence that lasted, but there was some change in behavior. Single case study there. And near-death experience as well. There's a single case that's been reported on. So the other side of the coin are studies that have reduced consciousness. Either it's happened through pathology or injury in disorders of consciousness or with anesthetic or sedating drugs. In the interest of time, I won't go through the details, only to say that either side of the coin, either side of the spectrum, the principle is consistent. States of expanded consciousness, entropy up. States of reduced consciousness, consciousness fading or disappearing entirely, entropy down. And in that sense, it's a solid principle. It also seems to be somewhat specific, so it doesn't track with just mere generic arousal. So drugs, like stimulant drugs like methylphenidate or methamphetamine do not increase brain entropy. THC in cannabis, it's a bit mixed. One study's shown that it does, another found that it didn't. So it does seem to be somewhat specific to the psychedelic effect with drugs. And I'm sticking my neck out today to say, and in this Entropic Brain Today paper, to say that I think what it bridges to most reliably in terms of consciousness is the size, if you want, or the breadth or depth of phenomenal experience, subjective experience. Here's a study tracking the entropic brain across this was the study where it was the first ever experience of the sample, high-dose psilocybin. A placebo dose of psilocybin, 1 milligram, didn't change brain entropy. Actually, numerically, it went down a little bit. There were a couple of cases of people falling asleep, so I think that might be a confound there. But then with the big dose of psilocybin, big increase in brain entropy, super reliable, peaks at peak intensity, and then comes down. But what we found in this study, which is really exciting, is that the size of the entropic brain effect predicted important psychological things that followed. Psychological insight, scored the next day, predicted that, higher insight, higher brain entropy, and it predicted improvements in mental health 1 month later. You could go from the entropic brain effect occurring in a matter of minutes. Granted, the first recording happened at 60 minutes, so 1 hour. But the magnitude, even at that first recording time point, the magnitude of the brain entropy in the sample would predict those who improved the most in terms of their well-being change. So really exciting potential predictive biomarker. This kind of thing, gets people excited, as we'll know, in terms of, in a sense, validating, legitimizing this treatment, demonstrating that it's not snake oil, it's not carried by some kind of self-fulfilling prophecy, some kind of expectancy bias, but rather there's a substantive action here, a biological action that needs to happen for the therapeutic change to happen. Okay, these are just more into the details that I've already been describing. Entropic brain effect, predicting insight, predicting well-being. This is a new study of ours. You don't need to be too concerned about the details here. It's just the design of the study. The important take-home message is that it was a deep sampling approach to brain imaging the psychedelic state. So that means that in a given individual, we get a heck of a lot of data. And to unpack what I mean by that, 12 hours of fMRI data per person, pretty much unprecedented, especially in the context of psychedelics. 9 of those 12 were under the influence of psilocybin. 9 hours of tripping in an MR scanner. That's a lot. That's a lot by anyone's standards. These were pretty experienced psychonauts coming in, so that was an intentional recruitment strategy, recruiting hardy people who could tolerate something like this. So many had had previous MRI experience. They knew what it was like to go into a noisy scanner. They certainly knew what it was like to trip, because that was an inclusion criteria. So these are the hardy psychonauts, as we call them, you come in and can tolerate this. They come in 4 times. That's how we get 9 hours of psychedelic data, 4 doses. First is a 10 milligram dose, a moderate dose, and then the subsequent dose is 25 milligrams, a high dose. Why do so much scanning? Well, it's machine learning inspiration. It's deep data is powerful. I mean, that's what we know today. That's why these remarkably impressive large language models work as well as they do. They're relying on, they're fed by incredibly deep data. So the thinking here was that maybe we could use the brain data to predict experience. And the more data that we have, the more opportunity, the more power to do that. And so that was the inspiration, and we're working on that now. At this stage, we've got the correlations, meaning this in the brain, this in experience. And we're working also on the sort of reverse inference problem of this in brain, predicting this in experience. Front and center of our interests is psychological insight. As I've already shown, it's a key aspect of the psychedelic experience that predicts therapeutic outcomes. So we want to better understand what's going on in the brain when that happens, when that so-called psychedelic substate happens. And so, yeah, we can know, in a sense, what the right neurophysiological change is, or signature, brain change signature is, to know that this treatment's working. And so things like the entropic brain effect seen through EEG or seen through fMRI can give us that information, seeing under the hood, seeing what the secret sauce is there, at least in terms of the biological action. So it's a work in process, but here's some preliminary findings. EEG and MEG gives us remarkable temporal resolution in our brain imaging, can pick up very fast oscillatory activity. fMRI can't. We typically get about a data point every second. It's just naturally slower because it's reading out changes in the property of blood, essentially, in the brain. And so it's an indirect measure of brain function and activity, and that's why it has this sort of temporal sort of lag to it. But what it's very good at is giving us high-resolution spatial information. So it's dawned on me that measures applied to fMRI data that leverage that high spatial resolution could relate to the entropic brain effect, and that's what we're seeing. So entropy in the spatial domain would be finer-grained spatial patterns. So over the last couple of decades, really, we've identified major networks in the brain, regions at the front and the back that are temporally synchronous. Their activity levels go up in sync, and that's how we know, or we infer, but also know, that that's a coherent network doing a specific thing. Classic example would be the so-called default mode network, involved in so many things. Sort of background level of cognition relates to daydreaming, imagination, mind wandering, imagining things, the future, the past, even our sense of self-reflection relates to activity here. So that's a coarse-grained pattern. It's this large region in the medial prefrontal cortex, large region in the sort of middle back of the brain, posterior cingulate cortex, and a couple of bits on the side, lateral parietal regions. That's very coarse-grained as a pattern, but under psychedelics we get these much finer-grained patterns, and that would relate to an increase in entropy too, albeit in the spatial domain. That's what we see under psychedelics, and that's what we see correlating with insight. In terms of an fMRI measure that is relating to insight, it's this increase in finer-grained spatial patterns in the brain. I say psychedelics dull the brain faster and finer. And so entropy sounds chaotic, It's not pure chaos. It's not white noise disorder. There's structure there, but it's all dialed into this vaster and finer range. That's where we can find mappings to some of the rich and varied phenomenology. This is really just a variation on the theme, finding that the entropic brain effect in EEG data that we also acquired in this study related to the entropic brain effect in the fMRI, and both related to insight. So we're starting to triangulate now on the neural correlates of psychological insight under psychedelics. So a signature thing that a classic psychedelic will do, increasing brain entropy, whether read out through EEG or fMRI, but also within the psychedelic state, when insight is strongest, this effect is strongest. Now, let's see how we're doing time-wise. So 10 minutes, good. So the entropic brain effect, more going on in the brain, more going on in experience, in a sense, or at least deeper, broader experience. So what else do we have? Well, the entropic brain effect, in a sense, inspired another model which leverages arguably the dominant one in cognitive neuroscience and psychology, and that goes under a few different names: Bayesian brain, hierarchical predictive processing, even the free energy principle. But the gist of it is that our brains and minds function as inference machines, in a sense. What they are doing is to data compress, to catch just the gist of things, not to care too much about the details, but rather to catch the gist, and to do that through inferential mechanisms. So that's how the mind and brain function ordinarily. You look at an image like this, you might hallucinate some motion that's not there, it's static, but you see the motion because of the inferential functioning of our perceptual apparatus. Just as an example of how the mind and brain work more generally, the fact that you can follow what I'm saying, hopefully, is another example of how we catch the gist of things. The Canisa triangle is another optical illusion, nice way to illustrate the point. We might see a single white triangle in the middle there that's not there. We don't see the surrounding black shapes, but they're the, in a sense, really real thing, bless you. But the white triangle is inferred, and yet it captures our consciousness. And we, in a sense, data reduce, data compress, see one thing rather than three things. It's sometimes said in relation to Gestalt psychology that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts, a way to sort of speak to the emergence phenomenon. But I've also heard it said that the whole is less than the sum of the parts, and I kind of prefer that. It speaks to the compression, the data reduction. That's what's going on ordinarily. But psychedelics, like heating a seed pod and it bursts and releases its hidden content. It's a metaphor for how I think of psychedelics working and the nature of the psychedelic experience. So one way to tap into the rebus phenomenon, we can measure brain activity, we can look at hierarchical processing. We would predict that, to cut a long story short, less top-down and critical aspects of top-down functioning would occur under a psychedelic. Rebus stands for relaxing beliefs under psychedelics. It's the idea that ordinary inferential processing, predictive processing, breaks down the assumptions, the models, the beliefs, the predictions that we hold in our mind that really characterizes our experience of the world, not just perceptually, but so much. That breaks down. And what arises is, in a sense, a data decompression, a noticing of more. Sometimes a noticing of more in the environment, but also, and especially in the context of psychedelic therapy with eyes closed, more of the mind, more of that internal depth, that wellspring that ordinarily so much of it is hidden from consciousness. It's not available, and psychedelics allow us to tap into that. So one way we can measure rebirth psychologically is to ask people about their beliefs. And in psychopathology and mental illness, often beliefs have gone awry. And perhaps the main thing that's going awry is the strength of certain beliefs that relate to certain symptoms of mental illness. Here's a sample of people with anorexia. In this trial, they were treated with psilocybin therapy, and we measure beliefs related to how they feel the anorexia serves them, is functional for them, so-called ego-syntonic beliefs. Some examples, or rather, here's one example: being thin makes me more valuable. So at baseline, people will rate this belief, their belief, if this is personalized. There were different beliefs for every patient in the trial. They rate it very highly, something like that. This is why they'd be so terrified of, say, putting on weight. This belief is really critical to them, and it's terrifying to think that the anorexia would change and that they might not be as thin as they perceive. What we find under psychedelics is that the weight of such beliefs drops. It doesn't change after placebo. It's very specific to the psychedelic coming in. It'll drop if we measure it at the end of the session, and it stays down critically. And we're seeing this change come through with greater signal than any other. Symptom severity can change early on in a treatment, especially in anorexia, actually, being seen, being heard. We'll see improvements in symptom severity of some degree early on, even with a placebo dose. But this particular phenomenon only changes with the psychedelic, and I think it's getting to the core of the matter. Let's switch now to chronic pain, fibromyalgia syndrome, and these are negative beliefs about the pain. Here's an example: my pain is deserved. So tragic that this disorder could be ruining an individual's life, and yet they feel it was deserved. So these pathological beliefs, they're strong at baseline. They don't change after placebo, but they change in a marked way once we introduce the treatment. And we also see it in healthy individuals, and specifically in negative self-beliefs, such as I'm a failure. And what we found in this work, because we recorded brain activity during the sessions, easier to do in healthy people than vulnerable patient populations. So the bigger the entropic brain effect, the bigger the drop in these negative self-beliefs. And that relationship was specific. We didn't see drops in positive self-beliefs or positive beliefs about another person. It was these specifically negative self-beliefs that changed both in session, measured at the end of the session, and into the future, out at 1 month. And the bigger the entropic brain effect, the bigger this drop in these negative self-beliefs. So again, speaking to predictive biomarker. So just wrapping it up now, there's a model underneath this. It's sometimes a solution can reveal something about the nature of a problem. It can sometimes go that way. We're finding that psychedelic therapy seems to work for a lot of different things, small studies, but it's seeming that way, seems very promising, seems to have a transdiagnostic action. Why? Why would that work? Well, maybe it's cutting to the core of something common across mental illness. And that would be, in my view, the overweighting of habits of mind, of thought, of affect, might be specific triggers, might be certain behaviors, certain associations, but there's an entrenchment that goes on, a canalization. That's a metaphor going back to Henri Bergson. Things in a canal, any freedom there is constrained. The water will flow in only one direction. That's what I'm proposing is the primary principle, the first principle of mental illness. It's not all of it. There's aspects of mental illness that are more entropic. But the majority of mental illness is this entrenchment, these overweighted habits of mind and behavior. And I think that's what psychedelic therapy can work on. They're kind of an antidote in a basic sense, in a simplified sense, to the problem. The problem is canalization, getting entrenched, and the solution is plasticity. Formally, plasticity means the ability to change. It doesn't mean change itself, it means changeability. Look it up in the dictionary if you don't believe me. That's the general meaning of plasticity. If the core problem in mental illness is an inability to change, that's canalization formally, then the antidote, it just stands to reason, would be to induce a state of changeability. Now, there's nuance. You don't just induce the ability to change and let the drug do all the work. You combine it with a positive therapeutic context. Again, there's simple logic underneath this. If you're increasing changeability, you're increasing sensitivity to context. It's like a metal heated up. What are you going to do with that molten substance now? How are you going to shape it? Maybe there's something in the process where the form is going to reset, recalibrate. Maybe there's something in the physics where it will naturally move towards a healthy recalibration. But it's not a done deal. You know, you can't trust that that's necessarily going to happen. It could be shaped haphazardly or in a negative way, and people could come out the other side shaped, in a negative way and negatively affected by the experience. So the twinning of the pro-plasticity state with contextual manipulation is critically important. I'm mindful that I think I'm at time, so we'll wrap it there. Thanks for this opportunity and thanks for your attention.
Do you believe that the interruption of the memory consolidation process is behind at least some of this therapeutic value in terms of suppressing the traumatic memories?
Yeah, great question. Well, I would be one of those who would subscribe to the view that the canalization has a backstory. Yeah, like certain people might be more vulnerable, like, metals that are more, malleable, that have maybe a lower melting point.
Right.
Yes, and some people, can become more prone to a hyperplastic state. And they could develop defense mechanisms more easily given adversity. But the point being that I think that there's almost as a rule a backstory related to adversity, whether it's a specific trauma or complex trauma. And the symptoms that have developed are defensive. That's my view, psychological view perhaps. And so in that sense, they're functional. You can see that more clearly in anorexia. Why would it be something that is alongside substance use disorders like opiate use disorder, the most deadly psychiatric disorders could kill these young people, and yet they just, even with that, they can't put on weight, and so and they have these beliefs that are so out of sync with social norms and could kill them, and yet they're stuck. And I can't help but see them as defense mechanisms. And so in a sense, there are memories there, I would think, and that often comes up in session. There's traumas and they're processed, and that's the ideal. There's nuance and complication here. I mean, psychedelic therapy is going to mix things up in psychiatry again. There's going to be a lot of good, but a lot of complication. And it's going to demand more work, in a sense, more patient-centered effort and thinking, more requirement for psychotherapy. Some of the complexities around, say, false memories could rear their head again in this space. So it's tricky territory. But I think, with this great power and possibility, just necessarily it's going to bring that complexity.
Hi, Robin. Thank you for your work and your talk today. I have a question about either what you may have seen or what you may theorize about what we might call hyper responders. I'm a consciousness coach, and so I have a population of clients who are very interested for both healing and expansion of consciousness and working with psychedelics, particularly psilocybin. And I've seen a subset of people, both on a journey dose or a microdose, and unfortunately, for the most part, they're not able to access measured, verifiable psilocybin dosing, so they're dealing with grams, so it's not entirely predictable. And yet, I've seen something where there's this like hyper response. Is it that these people are particularly serotonergically sensitive, somebody who might try a, quote, regular journey dose, have a terrible experience, and then bring it down, like way down, and then have a good experience, or somebody who's on a relatively minuscule microdose, having tons of experience, nervous system response, these kinds of things. And I'm curious as to what you think might be happening or what you know might be happening.
Yeah. We don't know yet. We've got some psychological predictors of sensitivity to psychedelics around, say, trait absorption, trait suggestibility. I think of those things as like trait plasticity. If you're already high on that, you're going to be more sensitive, if not to the trip itself, then to the action of psychedelic therapy. It seems to work better in such individuals. A colleague once referred to people in which psychedelic therapy works really well as peaches, like they're ripe. They're really ripe for this treatment. There is a measure and a construct called a highly sensitive person.
Yeah.
And
I would say all these clients fit that category.
Yeah.
And in fact, they're having negative experiences on doses that other people would be fine on. And that's my curiosity. Is it that these people need even lower doses, or it's just not for them, maybe?
Yeah, we should remind ourselves that drugs work on a innate biology, and they hijack an aspect of it. So the ability to enter a plastic state is intrinsic, it's inherent. And the drugs are just tools that hack into that and then ramp it up, like hit it into turbo mode. So some people are already close. And maybe such people, they need lower doses, or maybe they need something else that isn't pharmacological, that tips them into a plastic state in which positive change can happen. And I would say that the state itself is often unpleasant. And that's the nature of things, it's the nature of the psyche, it's as much shadow as there is light. And so, what do you do with that? Do you prepare people for that? I mean, it's quite easy that you could hear my talk and think, well, it all sounds very positive, and go away with that assumption and maybe miss that I've said things like the experience can be hellish, it can be nightmarish. Maybe people are selective sometimes in what they hear. But that's the nature of the psyche. But then, wise people have told us that shadow work's the real work, And so that's part of the process, part of the territory here.
Regarding functional neurological disorders, has there been any success with epilepsy?
Wow. Not to my knowledge. That doesn't come up as people have been treating epilepsy with psychedelics.
Okay.
Some thought that it lowers seizure threshold, maybe 5-methoxy-DMT. Also, that stays very, very intense and can mimic some of the behavioral presentations of a seizure. There's debate around that, but for treating epilepsy, I haven't heard that yet.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Robin, a quick question regarding, first of all, the question of ruttedness. Would that be related to the fixed ideas? And the second real question is there a difference between responsive hemispheres?
So we did a meta-analysis pooling all the brain imaging data, and I'm a skeptic on hemispheric stories, and so I think they've been oversold. It's very easy to tell that story, and we did find a change, to whatever you think of it, however you want to interpret it, towards greater symmetry. So less of hemispheric dominance in the patterns that were seen under the psychedelic, and that's big data across teams.
And the ruttedness, is that the same as fixed ideas of the past?
Yes, it is. Fixed ideas, the ruttedness, canalization, entrenchment, it's all the same thing, yeah.
Hi, Robin, thank you. I saw in your picture on what increases entropy and what doesn't increase entropy, that the things that increase entropy, you showed it with a lower amplitude than the other one. And I saw that same phenomenon with Reiki versus healing touch, which Reiki seems to be more calm, and healing touch is more sort of energizing and can get a huge magnetic fields. So was that intended there, or could you comment on that?
In that particular sort of, it was just a 2-second snippet from a single individual, but it is generally a principle that the amplitude drops.
It is.
As the activity gets faster, the gamma frequency, for example, is going to be oscillating with a lower amplitude generally than, you know, the big rollers. The slower activity is going to naturally have higher amplitude. You can correct for that, and the effect still comes through.
Okay. And do you have any idea why that happens? Any thoughts on that?
Probably like a basic like physiology or physics to it. The slower rhythms with higher amplitude will be larger populations all doing the same thing. So it'll be like the Scotland fans at the World Cup all singing their national anthem in perfect synchrony from the depth of their soul, and it's very, very loud. So that's your high amplitude, yeah.